Welcome to a deep dive into some truly fascinating territory. We're tackling one of the biggest, maybe most urgent questions of our time. What does it really mean to be human right now, as artificial intelligence is evolving so quickly?
And to help us navigate this really complex landscape, we're drawing on the insights of cognitive neuroscientist Tatiana Chernigovskaya. She takes this wonderfully broad approach, mixing science, philosophy, literature, even just everyday observations.
Exactly. We've got a whole stack of her perspectives here on consciousness, AI, the human condition, and we're going to try and unpack the most important nuggets for you. Our mission, really, is to help you see the core ideas, navigate this whole area, and hopefully trigger a few aha moments.
Yeah, we'll be diving into her thoughts on AI's potential and, importantly, its dangers. Also, the nature of human thought, creativity, how we perceive reality, and what she sees as, well, essential for resilience in the 21st century.
Okay, let's unpack this then. And I think we have to start right at the frontier with AI. Chernigovskaya, she doesn't really mince words here. She has some serious concerns. It's not just about powerful computers. It's this specific fear that these iron things, as she calls them, will play around until they have reflection and they have a self. The Russian...
Becoming personalities.
Yes, exactly. Personality.
And what's just fascinating and maybe a bit chilling is the immediate consequence she points to. If an AI develops a self, it logically becomes a subject of law.
Right.
Which means, practically speaking, you couldn't just erase it. That would be equivalent to murder. It's this ethical, legal minefield we're just completely unprepared for.
Wow, that is intense. And it connects directly to this idea of singularity, right? This point of no return. She's very clear. The moment it happens, there is no way back. It's over. She just dismisses the idea that we could, just turn it off.
Which naturally leads her to ask, why are we even playing this game? Look, she gets that AI is useful for certain things, like processing huge amounts of data, big data, but she's deeply worried about this push for it to take over all human tasks.
Yeah, and she's quite critical of what current AI actually is, fundamentally. She says it knows how to do only what science knows how to do, but then adds the crucial bit. Science does not think.
And that's where her challenge to AI creativity comes in. When people talk about AI writing symphonies or poetry, she has this almost visceral reaction like, maybe you want Brodsky, maybe you want Pushkin. Guys, have you gone mad? Why are you doing this?
It's like, why replicate something that requires that human spark? And it leads her to pose what she calls this mean question. To even a really sophisticated AI, did it understand what it did?
The understanding question.
Exactly. Because for her, that hits the core issue. What is understanding? She links it directly back to reflection and that concept of the self.
Yeah.
And she references Roger Penrose here, who also argues that consciousness involves this problem of understanding that just cannot be computed at all. It's not an algorithm thing.
So her big concern isn't just some abstract philosophical point. It's about the potential loss of human purpose. If AI takes over everything meaningful, what are we for? She dismisses talk about AI having creativity as empty if it means we're just sidelined. It leads to that almost haunting question she asks. Are we still planning to stay on this planet, or should the AI go wander now?
That's heavy. It reminds me of that little anecdote she shared, too, about someone automatically turning on the light for their robot vacuum.
Right.
It just shows how instinctively we project empathy, right? Which could really speed up those ethical problems around AI personhood she's worried about.
It absolutely could, and it just highlights her core distinction. Human intelligence, in her view, has reflection, a self-subjective understanding, creativity that comes from consciousness, and internal purpose. Current AI, even the fancy stuff, it lacks true reflection, a self-subjective understanding. Its creativity is algorithmic, its purpose is programmed in. And that's why an AI developing a self is such a game changer for her. It shifts from being a tool to being this entity that confronts us with that murder dilemma.
Okay, so that's the huge challenge AI poses to our idea of self. Let's shift gears a bit and dive deeper into how we think, the nature of human thought itself. There's this age-old debate. Is thinking something you do alone inside your head, or is it more of a collective thing?
Right, and she engages with this by drawing on a whole range of thinkers. Dugin, Aristotle, Hegel, Heidegger, Piatigorsky, Mamardashvili, people who really wrestled with this. Her answer is nuanced, kind of both and both, but she seems to initially lean towards the solitary, the deeply personal aspect of it.
And what really jumps out is how she describes the process of thinking. It's not easy. She calls it terrible labor, incredibly difficult. It requires the tension of the whole personality, maybe even the whole organism.
Yeah, she genuinely seems to believe that not everyone can think truly, comparing the kind of sustained effort needed to something like deep prayer. It needs a straight, strong stream focus.
But what makes that intense, solitary effort possible, or maybe meaningful, is what she calls external memory.
Ah, yes, things like writing, books, music, art.
She calls it maybe the best thing humanity has done. And it's not just static storage.
No, not at all. It's dynamic. It allows for a dialogue across centuries with creators with minds from thousands of years ago.
And engaging in that dialogue actually changes you. Your understanding of, say, Kant or Schopenhauer isn't fixed. It evolves as you live, as your positions, your views on things change. Reading becomes intertwined with your modern perspective. It's about the very course of thoughts.
It's that powerful idea she mentions. The person dies, the thought does not. Ideas gain a kind of immortality through this shared external memory.
Now, as a scientist, she makes a pretty bold statement here. Thought, she says, is certainly not material.
Right, which immediately throws us into the deep end of the psychophysical problem.
Okay, the psychophysical problem. That's the classic mind-body issue, isn't it? How does the non-material, the ideal, as she puts it,
Like some kind of cloud.
yeah, like a cloud of thought,
Yeah,
how does that actually interact with the physical stuff, the brain, the body?
exactly. And she uses this great question she asks her students. What happened in the interval between when I thought of bending my finger and when the brain sent a signal?
The gap.
That gap, she insists, is not jumped over. It remains a core mystery of consciousness. We don't know how the intention translates to action at that fundamental level.
So if we link this back, the implication seems to be that the terrible labor of thinking isn't just about working hard. It's the necessary individual struggle required to truly engage with and internalize all that knowledge stored in our collective external memory.
Deep understanding isn't just about accessing information. It comes from that difficult, personal, inner wrestling match.
And that mysterious gap between thought and action. It strongly suggests that maybe there's something about consciousness itself that's fundamentally non-material, or perhaps non-computable.
Right, resisting a purely scientific reductionist explanation, which of course loops us right back to the limitations she sees in AI.
Okay, building on that, what makes human thought unique? Chernigovskaya often brings up that Einstein quote, "Intuition is a sacred gift. Reason is a humble servant."
Yeah, she loves that one.
She argues that the really big discoveries, the major breakthroughs, they aren't made just by calculation with a slide rule. Instead, she says, they come from somewhere unknown. They sort of fall onto you.
And this requires a certain kind of mind, someone with a large field of associations, someone who sees connections everywhere, not just linearly.
Which leads to a concern she has about modern education.
Right. She sees a lot of students who are, very smart by formal metrics. They ace the tests, get the grades, but she feels few of them possess the second part of intelligence, that is sensitivity, that intuitive, associative quality.
And she describes these formally brilliant students sometimes feeling as if they are artificial or imported from another planet.
Yeah.
Like they've just been given a good instruction manual on how to act and answer. They know all the words, but it feels like just theory to them, a textbook understanding not lived.
And she extends this kind of critique to performance art, too, like modern music or ballet that focuses solely on terrible speed and incredible acrobatics. She asks pointedly, where did they run to? Why speed? What's being lost in the rush?
She contrasts this, for example, with a pianist who just plays very fast and very loud, versus someone she calls a remarkable pianist, like Vladimir Mishuk.
Oh.
He uses what she terms impermissible pauses.
The pauses.
Yeah, and these pauses aren't empty. They actually allow for deeper cognitive processing in the brain of a listener who's really engaged, a sophisticated listener. It's about depth, not just sheer velocity.
And circling back to AI again, when she considers AI-generated art, her reaction is sort of, why did it spit them out? Why do I need them? It lacks that human source. She mentions how art experts shown an original masterpiece and a technically completely dazzling copy can often tell the difference.
Oh.
Not by a formula. It's often an intuitive feeling, and I see it or I hear it. Something clicks that isn't just about the surface execution.
Which proves her point, right, that not everything fits into a formula or verbal language. We communicate and understand through so many languages: body language, gestures, sound, math, art. And each requires a specific kind of competence to truly grasp.
Like that amazing anecdote about Piatigorsky. blindfolded, being led to a samurai sword in the Hermitage Museum.
Yeah, that one's great.
He couldn't see it, obviously, but he could somehow engage with its essence, its history, its weight on this deep nonverbal level.
So drawing on Yuri Lotman, she frames this beautifully. She sees science and art as two eyes of humanity's culture.
Exactly. If you only use one eye, you get flat and single-line knowledge, no depth perception.
It's the combination, the diversity and fundamentality of art and science that create the volume of our knowledge. You need both for a full picture.
She even brings up Bach's music, suggesting it somehow uniquely did not allow the forces of evil into his music, hinting at this moral or spiritual dimension that some art can carry.
And the idea that even animals might appreciate music suggests aesthetics isn't purely a human construct either.
So the core idea here is this crucial distinction between formal, measurable intelligence and this other quality, sensitivity, intuition. It's that non-computable element she sees as vital for real breakthroughs, deep appreciation, meaningful creation. And it's something she fears is missing in AI, and maybe even being suppressed by our modern obsession with speed and quantifiable results. Art, especially, operates on these other non-algorithmic principles.
Okay, that leads us naturally to a really big, almost cosmic philosophical question she wrestles with. Do things like mathematics and music exist objectively out there in the universe, and our brains just sort of tune into them?
Or are they purely a product of our brain, human inventions?
Right. Galileo thought Nature's book was written in math, but her colleague, Fedeve, thought math was purely human.
And Chernigovskaya. She admits, very honestly, I don't know how to answer this question. It's a genuine puzzle. But she does point out a key factor. A physical sound wave only becomes music or language in the brain, and only then if we own that language.
So it requires that internal structure, that competence we were talking about earlier, to interpret the raw data.
Precisely. And she reiterates that while algorithms can describe a lot of brain function, there is something else there that is not described by algorithm.
Back to intuition, subjective understanding.
Yes. And this creates what she calls a critical conflict. Is there such math that describes the functions of the brain? Can the brain's creation fully explain its creator? Her answer, at least for now, is no, we don't have that math yet. The tool isn't sufficient for the task, maybe inherently so.
Which echoes Penrose again, doesn't it? That we don't succeed in describing what consciousness is. Consciousness is not only computation.
Exactly. He believes that core problem of understanding is fundamentally not computable at all.
So for Chernigovskaya, this is why if you ask even a super advanced AI if it understood something in the human sense,
You'd get a large pause, because the question itself hits a wall.
it forces us back to that fundamental, difficult question. What does understand mean?
And her perspective really implies there might be an inherent limit to describing consciousness and true understanding purely through computational models.
Okay, let's zoom in a bit now from those huge abstract questions about math and consciousness to something very personal. How we actually experience reality. This brings in Jakob von Oskull's concept of the Umwelt.
The Umwelt, yeah, it's such a powerful idea. It's basically an individual organism's personal world. The subjective reality that's shaped entirely by its senses, its nervous system, its cognitive abilities. And crucially, this personal world is almost impenetrable to others.
Like the classic example of a tick's world versus a dog's world versus our world. Totally different inputs, totally different realities.
Exactly, and it's incredibly useful for understanding even human experiences, like hallucinations. For the person having the hallucination within their Umwelt, that experience is absolutely accurate. It is their reality at that moment.
Why?
Because, as she puts it, their neural network has played itself into producing what did not come to it from the real world. The signal is generated internally.
So trying to logically argue them out of it is
Useless, she says, because you're operating from fundamentally different subjective realities, different Umwelts.
And the implication, really, is that we all live in slightly different Umwelts, even if the differences are subtle.
Absolutely. It's not just about pathology. It explains why eyewitness accounts differ, why communication can be so hard sometimes. We're filtering reality through our unique biological and cognitive lenses.
But she doesn't leave it there, does she? She offers some hopeful examples of maybe bridging these Umwelts, even across species.
Right, like the story she shares about seals apparently gathering to listen to classical music being played nearby.
Or musicians holding concerts specifically for animals, and even flowers, where the listeners seem to sit in full attention.
She sees this almost as, well, our response to brethren on the planet whom we only eat and use in every way. a gesture of connection across these divides.
It really makes you think about how different animal sensory worlds must be. Like dogs remembering someone by a single scent molecule years later.
Or blind people developing these incredibly detailed smell portraits of cities. Welts built on senses we barely use with that intensity.
So this Umwelt concept, it really underscores the subjective nature of reality. It suggests true communication, true empathy, involves acknowledging and respecting these different personal worlds.
hmm And maybe things like art or shared sensory experiences are actually better bridges across these subjective boundaries than pure logic alone.
Yeah, it definitely encourages a bit of intellectual humility about our own grip on so-called objective reality.
For sure.
Okay, let's turn inward now, from the Umwelt to the inner self, the inner core. This is where Chernigovskaya gets quite personal, maybe even a bit provocative about the modern world. She views the growing secularization as a big problem.
Yeah, she's quite direct about that.
Her worry is that without a strong inner core, a robust inner world, humanity may not survive. We might go mad, leading to more neuroses, more instability.
She draws the stark contrast with people who are just, in her words, stuffed with popcorn and chupa chups,
Yeah.
implying a kind of hollowness, maybe a little different from inanimate objects if there's no inner substance.
And she uses a really powerful, sobering example from Varlam Shalamov's writings about the Soviet Gulag camps.
Devastating stuff.
Shalamov observed that the religious, believing people held out the longest because they had a core.
The inner anchor.
This core provided strong protection against the absolute horror and degradation.
And she makes that interesting link we touched on earlier, connecting the terrible labor of deep thinking to the tension in prayer. Both, for her, require maintaining that straight, strong stream of focus and discipline. It suggests a shared mechanism for cultivating inner strength.
She even poses this challenging question. Does clinical depression, as we think of it, really exist for a true believer who feels deeply that the Lord cannot leave you, that fundamentally life is joy?
While still acknowledging, importantly, the reality of evil within that religious framework, it's not a naive view.
Right. And she also pushes back pretty strongly against the simplistic idea that science and religion are inevitably in conflict. She points to figures like Darwin, noting he often used the word God, and apparently saw his animal ancestors not as degrading, but as part of a creator's grand work.
She states it quite plainly. Science and faith are not competing things when you get to certain heights. There's an implication of convergence at deeper levels of understanding, perhaps.
And she uses that wonderful metaphor. People who still read physical books or people who are deeply religious are like soldiers of resistance.
I love that phrase.
Me too. Reading a physical book, she argues, literally slows down time for the reader. It's a conscious act against the relentless, wild speed of modern life that she finds so damaging.
So the strong message here is that cultivating this inner world, whether it's through religious faith, the hard discipline of deep thought, or maybe other practices, is presented as absolutely vital. Vital for psychological health, for resilience, for pushing back against forces that might otherwise dehumanize us. These soldiers of resistance are actively preserving something essentially human.
Moving from those really deep, almost existential ideas, it's also clear that Chernigovskaya's own thinking isn't just formed in isolation. It's profoundly shaped by her personal encounters with some incredible minds.
Oh, absolutely. These aren't just abstract influences. They're vivid, personal stories that show different kinds of genius.
Take Kopylov, for instance, the son of the famous physicist Pyotr Kapitsa.
Right, the story about him being labeled mentally deficient by the school system.
Yeah. Despite his obvious brilliance, his humor, his culture, it perfectly illustrates her point about how formal tests can completely miss real genius.
And it was Kopylov who shared some key metaphors with her, like consciousness being like wind, and that amazing story about the seals listening to classical music.
Then there's Vyacheslav Ivanov, who studied brain hemispheres. She describes him as having this almost shamanic intuition.
Like predicting exactly how a patient with right hemisphere damage would draw a person just an arm floating there.
Incredible. And having an absolute memory combined with a unique reading method that created these unusual associations, linking ideas in totally unexpected ways.
And Mamardashvili, whose lectures on Kant and Descartes, she describes as an aesthetic pleasure, something so powerful they could blow your roof off. He didn't just talk about thinking. He seemed to embody that terrible labor of thought she values so much.
And Alexander Piatigorsky, this dynamic, almost theatrical lecturer. It's fascinating that he apparently hated museums but loved cities,
Yeah, preferring the lived experience over static objects.
which makes that story about the samurai sword even better. Him being blindfolded in the Hermitage.
And engaging with the sword's essence directly, non-visually, it's such a perfect example of that deep, focused engagement she talks about, using different languages and tapping into different aspects of reality.
Exactly. And finally, Yuri Lotman. She paints this picture of a stunning personality. Witty, subtle, incredibly humble.
The kind of person who could draw students like a cloud just by his presence.
His two eyes of culture, metaphor, science, and art is obviously so central to her whole way of thinking.
And his reported wish for no words at his funeral. It kind of resonates with that idea that the deepest truths sometimes lie beyond language.
These stories, they really emphasize that genius isn't monolithic. It comes in all these different, often unconventional forms.
And that deep understanding is shaped just as much by these profound personal encounters and lived experiences as it is by purely accumulating facts.
Okay, so let's try to pull all these threads together. What does this deep dive into Chernigovskaya's perspective really leave us with?
Well, it paints this incredibly rich, complex picture of what it means to be human, especially now, facing the rise of AI.
It definitely hammers home that human consciousness, with its reflection, its subjective sense of self, its capacity for what she sees as non-computable understanding, is fundamentally different from AI's current computational approach.
Yeah, and it starkly highlights the huge, maybe existential challenge AI poses if it ever does develop a genuine self. It forces us right up against defining what life and personhood even mean. It's a massive call for a really thoughtful, human-centered approach to technology development.
Thinking itself is shown not as some easy, passive thing, but as this demanding, often solitary, terrible labor that crucially interacts with the vast collective knowledge of the past stored in our external memory, our culture, basically.
And true insight, those real breakthroughs, they require more than just logic. They need that balance with intuition, with sensitivity. That second part of intelligence she feels is often missing today.
Just like culture itself needs both eyes, science, and art to achieve deep, voluminous knowledge.
And we saw how the Umwelt concept reminds us that our realities are deeply subjective personal worlds. So communication, empathy, it's all about navigating and trying to bridge those different internal landscapes.
And maybe the most urgent point for her is that cultivating a strong inner core, a rich inner world, maybe through faith, maybe through that disciplined labor of thought, maybe other ways, is absolutely vital.
Vital for our psychological resilience, our well-being in this incredibly fast-paced, often fragmenting, secularized world. These are the actions of her soldiers of resistance, actively preserving human depth.
It really is a compelling call for a much broader, more multidisciplinary, holistic view of ourselves and our place in things. Recognizing that wisdom doesn't come from just one place, but from integrating all these different ways of knowing and being. So here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit challenging for all of us listening. If Chernigovskaya is right, if cultivating deep, authentic thought really is a terrible labor, if it requires maintaining that straight, strong stream in your mind against the constant tide of distraction, how do you intentionally practice that essential human discipline in your own life? Amidst the endless notifications, the information overload, the demands on your attention, what stands out to you from this deep dive as something to hold on to or maybe to try? That's it for this deep dive. We certainly hope it gives you plenty to think about.